Welcome to my final InSTEP session. I am delighted to have three distinguished diplomats join me for my final public act at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So let me say that I'm really a special thanks to Ambassador Nides, Ambassador Burns, and Ambassador Nuland for joining me for this special session. I note there is a global audience here today. I thank my American Chamber friends from around the world, ambassadors and embassies represented here today. Of course, my corporate friends and think tank and media that are joining us, and our C-SPAN audience. I want to begin by saying that I am not going to review the 29 years that I put in at the U.S. Chamber. I will simply say it's been an incredible journey for me, and I could not have done it without the outstanding team at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Tom Donahue, when he suggested I run the international program at the U.S. Chamber over a decade ago, told me to run hard and run fast and build. And that's what we've done over the last decade as we expanded around the world. I've been traveling for millions of miles on behalf of the U.S. Chamber and half of American business. And of course, over those years, I've witnessed history, had a front row seat to many historical events, including in the U.S.-China relationship. Charlene Barshevsky is here today, but I was there to witness her signing the bilateral agreement that sent China into the WTO. Ambassador Burns may have some reflections about that. I've also had the chance to do some things over my course of years. I won't talk about them all, but I think about the sandstorm in Western China or the jellyfish off the coast of Mexico, or I think about the donkey rides up the mountains in Petra, or, of course, the great experience that I had with Kurt Campbell and Wendy Sherman and others in managing in the aftermath of a deadly earthquake in New Zealand. The adventures really don't matter to me as much as the people that I've worked with, both inside the chamber and outside the chamber. I want to thank the entire leadership of the U.S. Chamber, Suzanne Clark and the team. I want to acknowledge members of my own team. Nisha, Scott Eisner, Nisha Biswal, Scott Eisner, Gary Littman, John Murphy, Kush Choksi, Neil Harrington, Marjorie Chorlins, Anita Patel, Josh Cram, Jeremy Waterman, and so many more at the Chamber that have made this journey so wonderful, so incredible, and so memorable. A really special thanks also to the AV team at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that has had to put up with me, particularly during the COVID period and post-COVID period, as we continue to do these virtual forums. Much has happened since we started InSTEP over a decade ago, and I know that some of the founding members of InSTEP, the International Strategic Trade and Economic Platform, are here on this call today. Karan Bhatia at Google, and Bruce Stokes at the German Marshall Fund, and John Bussey from the Wall Street Journal, and many others who helped me launch InSTEP as a conversation about American leadership. And if I think about 10 years ago or 12 years ago when we started this program, the world has quite changed. Of course, we saw a rising China then, but today we see a much more muscular China. In fact, we see more tensions, not just with the United States, but with Europe and others. We see now a war in Europe, unprovoked aggression from Russia, and how we manage that, and how do we exit from this war. We see climate change taking even more prominence in the world today. We see a pandemic that's hit us and changed the world forever. We see increasing energy around food and security issues and energy issues that cause us all to think about how we are as a community. America's role in the world has never been more important. But we also know that the world cannot be divided into blue and red teams. So how does America work with Europe and other allies in restoring our place in bringing world order and stability to a time where there's quite a bit of conflict around the world? We're going to get into that in today's conversation. But I just would be remiss if I didn't thank all the members of the Chamber, all the government officials who have participated in programs with me over the years, the hundreds of heads of state that I've probably hosted, the many ministers, the ambassadors, and others. And I just want to thank everyone for having faith in the U.S. Chamber and the role we play in supporting government and supporting America's role in the world today. With that, let me transition to today's program. And let me begin by saying that this event today with three of America's most respected diplomats seems an appropriate way to end my tenure at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I want to start with a friend and reflect on the role of Secretary Albright, who said last year, who we lost last year, who said last year, if we have to use force, it is because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall. We see the world for what it is. We're going to pose the question today. Is America still the indispensable nation? Do we have the tools we need to project our leadership time of economic and geopolitical uncertainty? In fact, former Secretary Kissinger called that into question recently when he raised the issue of whether or not there is a global leadership vacuum. There is a common refrain that America is pulling back from the world, that American strength and impact overseas is diminishing, and that other powers, including China and Russia, are seeping into that. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I'm sure our guests will have a very different perspective as well about the role of American leadership in this world today. In the face of challenges from climate change to food security to global health system resiliency and beyond, U.S. leadership can help galvanize partners and allies to make a difference, to have a profound impact and shape on world events. Today's discussion will look at ways America is extending its leadership, the areas and spheres where the leadership is most necessary, and what is driving and leading American diplomats to be a part of the solution. Let me begin with very brief introductions of three very distinguished diplomats. Ambassador Nick Burns is one of the nation's most distinguished diplomats. We're fortunate that he has helped navigate one of America's most complex challenges. And if you think about his nearly 3 decades of government service, he has served 6 presidents and 9 secretaries of state. And I have to say, as Undersecretary of Political Affairs, he's led negotiations on the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement and a long-term military assistance agreement with Israel. He also was a point of the Iranian nuclear diplomacy, serving as a point person in the second Bush administration. So he has served both Democratic and Republican presidents, and he has many other achievements, also having served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Next up is Ambassador Tom Nides. He was confirmed as U.S. Ambassador to Israel. Since taking up his post in Jerusalem, he has been a very active ambassador, very active on social media, and he's been at the forefront of some important developments, including dealing with the Abraham Accords and as well as dealing with recent tensions in Israel and its surrounding areas. Prior to his current role, Tom was managing director and vice chairman of Morgan Stanley. He served as U.S. State Department Deputy Secretary of State for then Secretary Clinton, and he's had other important roles in government and in the private sector. And finally, Victoria Nuland, Ambassador Nuland, was confirmed in April 21 as Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs, making her the State Department's highest-ranking career diplomat. She has incredible experience over 3 decades, serving in various posts, including as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasia Affairs from September 2013 until January 2017, and as State Department spokesman as well. She was the first female U.S. ambassador to NATO during President George Bush's second term and chief negotiator on important treaties as well. And she has served at overseas posts in Russia, China, and Mongolia. Let me begin with each of you, and thank you again for being with us here today, with some personal reflections. Each of you have served in government and at times left government and have come back. First of all, what inspired you each to be in government service? And 2, how is today's time different than, say, previous times you've been in government? Victoria, let me start with you.
Well, first, Myron, thank you for having all of us, but more importantly, thank you for your almost 30 years of incredible, may I say, brilliant leadership at the Chamber. You have invigorated the relationship between government and business over all of these years. You provided a platform for our foreign guests to connect to business, and you've been a friend and mentor to many, many of us. So thank you for all of that, and I hope you get to have a pina colada somewhere fabulous after this. I will say quickly that I was raised by a physician who basically felt that, the only worthy professions were in the services. So you go into the military, you could be a doctor, you could be in the clergy. But I also came from a household of divorce. So I was the family diplomat between my two parents. And then the third influence, I hooked on Tolstoy and Dostoevsky as a teenager. They were my gateway drugs, if you will, to all things Russian. And when I came out of university, it was high Reagan and there wasn't much business in Russia. So I went the government route and never turned back, and have had the honor also to serve with Nick Burns and Tom Nides, and loved it all the time. Both of them have been my bosses. With Nick, I basically just followed him in most of the jobs that he pursued. Look, I think, obviously we are now at the end of the post-Cold War period. We're in the post-Cold War period. So to me, unfortunately, it feels a lot like it did at the beginning of my career, that we have large powers contesting the rules of the road that favor freedom. They are doing it by threatening their neighbors, by coercing countries around the world. And therefore, U.S. leadership, which has always been essential, is even more essential. I will leave it there and hear from colleagues.
Nick Burns, your reflections on what's bringing you back to government, what concerns you, and what's inspiring you.
Well, Myron, thank you. And I want to join Toria in just congratulating you on your terrific 3 decades at the U.S. Chamber. There's been nothing like it. And we're going to all miss you, but we know you've got a great future ahead. And so congratulations on that. I also just wanted to say to answer your question, what a pleasure it is to serve with people like Victoria Nuland, who's one of my closest friends and closest partners in the U.S. Foreign Service, both of us career Foreign Service officers. And to think that we can attract people like Tom Nides, who's had this career between business and public service, it really is a strength of America. You asked me why I came back into government. I was a Foreign Service officer, left in 2008, taught at Harvard for 13 years. I came back, I suspect, for the same reasons that Toria and Tom did. I'm sure when the president called Tom Nides and said, I want you to be ambassador to Israel, it probably took him not a long time to reflect and answer yes. I know that when the president called Toria to be Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, of course Toria was going to serve. And when the president called me, I had the same reaction. Of course I accepted, because if you can't get if you can't get excited about public service in these 3 jobs, you're in the wrong business. And in my case, I've been going back and forth to China for 34 years. But I knew it was a critical time for our relationship with China. I believed in the president's vision. I knew that we had bipartisan support in the Congress between Republicans and Democrats for a really robust American policy to defend our interests out here in the Indo-Pacific, to compete with the Chinese where we absolutely have to compete, and to try to engage them on issues like climate change, global health, agriculture. And so it was a job, obviously, that I accepted with a great deal of humility, but a great deal of purpose, that China is going to be one of the great challenges for Americans going forward. For my wife and I have 3 daughters, for our kids, for our grandchildren, and just concluding my first year here, Myron. And it is a tough job with a lot of challenges, but we have a wonderful, great, high-performing U.S. mission staff across China. So happy to be here.
Thank you. Tom, your reflections and thoughts?
Well, I feel like this is kind of like your bar mitzvah. Okay. I am the American ambassador in Israel, but this is kind of like, I'm hoping that you give us a little bit of your Haftorah portion or something that brings us home. But listen, I want to second Toria and Nick's view. Listen, man, you and I have known each other for a long time. We've had lots of fun, enjoyable trips together, a lot of activity. The idea, you represent what's great about getting in the game. As the 3 of us have gotten in the game at different points, you've been in the game at a really important time, which is the relationship between the business community and government is critical. None of us should forget that. I've had the honor to be in business. I've had the honor to be on the government. The reality is business and government need to work together. They need to have common agendas. Even when we disagree, we need to be involved. And you have been at the epicenter of that. You represent that. It's not Democrats or Republicans or business or government. You represent of just trying to do the right thing. So I am, you and I are good pals. We've spent a lot of time talking about things, but I'm honored to be your friend. I'm honored that I could be here for this. And I'm sure you and I will be doing lots of stuff together. So thank you very much. Why to get in government? Listen, not dissimilar to Victoria, listen, I was the youngest of 8 kids. I'm a little Jewish kid from Minnesota. My parents didn't have any money, but the one thing we had was this commitment to give back, which is to get into the game, be it being involved in our synagogue or being involved in the community. But my parents always instilled on me, you can't just sit on the sidelines and complain. You got to get involved and be part of it. And I've been fortunate enough for people to be nice enough to allow me to be in the game. Because as we all know, all of us are smart enough, but it takes a lot of luck, a lot of perseverance to be able to do what all of us on the screen have done to give back in some way. I will also say, listen, I'm humbled to be on the same screen as the three of you guys. Listen, Burns and Nuland are like world-class diplomats. I'm in the junior leagues, so I'm honored to be part of this, not only this group, but just watching how they've maneuvered around in the diplomatic circles, and clearly both of them are playing an enormous role. I would just like to say, when you mention this issue about indispensable role and has the United States role weakened over time, just look at what Victoria Nuland has done with everyone, including the Secretary of State and the President, and leading the way of stopping this insanity of Putin in Ukraine, right? If it was not for the United States of America, if it wasn't for the United States of America, NATO wouldn't be together as it is. We would not be, the Ukraine would not be in the game. And we have led this world on trying to do something which will change the world. So I think we just, actions speak louder than words. And obviously in this particular case, this State Department, this president has done what he said he was going to do, which is stand up for the values of the United States of America. So that's how I'd answer that question. And I'm glad to be here, Myron.
Well, Tom, that's a great lead in to the topic around Ukraine, but I'm going to take 1 second and ask each of you, how does the political polarization in our country impact America's standing in the world and our work around these important geopolitical challenges? Nick?
Well, Myron, in my case, as I said before, I think that one of the great advantages we have right now in dealing with a very difficult government here in the People's Republic of China in a competitive relationship is that we have large-scale bipartisan agreement that we ought to be competing with China for military power in the Indo-Pacific, competing in the economic and trade sphere for a much more level playing field for American business, because it's not level right now. We're certainly competing on technology. And of course, we defend our values. We defend human rights. We take great issue with what the Chinese have done in Xinjiang and Tibet and Hong Kong, the lack of religious freedom here. And I think there's large-scale agreement, frankly, in our country, and also between Republicans and Democrats in Congress, that we've got to be competing in those 4 areas. I also think most Americans would say, as we largely have a difficult, challenging, competitive relationship with China, we are the 2 largest economies. We're the 2 most powerful countries in the world. We've got to be able to work with each other. And while there may be some disagreements, I think most Americans would say the 2 largest carbon emitters ought to be working together on climate change. If we're going to do something to strengthen the World Health Organization, then we're going to have to push China to be more active in it and to, of course, be more honest about what happened 3 years ago in Wuhan with the origin of the COVID-19 crisis. We're going to have to work together on food security. And Toria, of course, has been working on the problem of the lack of grain exports from Ukraine, especially from Ukraine to the rest of the world, which has produced a food crisis in parts of Africa and other parts of the world. So I think most Americans would say we've got to be present in the relationship with China. And I feel the bipartisan support, Myron, from both parties in Congress, from the House and the Senate. And it's very important that we maintain that, because China will try to divide us at home, as they have tried to do in the past. And we've got to have the discipline, and I think self-awareness and strategic clarity to stick together. I consider this one of the great advantages that we have, that our mission has, that I have as ambassador out on point here for the United States as we try to deal with this difficult relationship.
Victoria, let me turn to you next, because obviously the president recently went to Kyiv. That was a very important visit, symbolically important. And it comes at a time when you could say that the transatlantic relationship has been incredibly strong. But as the war goes on in Ukraine, as Russia's unprovoked aggression continues, how do we manage both our relationship with our allies on this issue, the longer it goes, and most importantly, in Washington, where some Republicans have at times signaled perhaps they would weaken their support. And that would be, I think, the wrong message. Nick has put that in the context of the U.S.-China relationship, but I think the two are related. Victoria, what concerns do you have about polarization here politically, and how it impacts an important agenda in Europe?
Well, Myron, I would say in my more than 30 years in government, we're actually on international issues, as Nick said, more united than during most periods of my career. You know, we're deeply cleaved as a country in terms of domestic politics, in terms of the culture wars, in terms of our definition of rights and freedoms at home. But if you look at what's happening, not simply in terms of the unity on China, the unity on support for Israel, Tom will speak about, but on Ukraine, you know, the U.S. has contributed more than $30 billion to the security, economic prosperity, humanitarian situation in Ukraine. And you can't do that without overwhelming support of both parties in the Congress. You're not wrong that on the fringes of both parties, folks are starting to question. But fundamentally, when you look at how this issue is polling around the country, Americans hate a bully. They do not want to stand on the sidelines while Putin's Russia eats its neighbor. And they understand that if we don't stop this war here, if we don't restore international law and respect for the UN Charter, then this thing's just going to keep going. Putin will keep going, but more importantly, equally importantly, it's going to embolden other dictators, bullies, autocrats around the world, including Xi Jinping. So I think Americans, by and large, understand the stakes. They also understand that we have to become more resilient. We have to invest in our own democracy. That's what you see with the passage of the CHIPS Act and with the IRA. And when America can lead like that, both with our own investments in beating back Russia in Ukraine and in our own resilience, that gives us leverage in convincing allies, in the Ukraine case, some 50 countries around the world, to try to match us. And in fact, the global community has matched us in the Ukraine context, and that is a direct result of the fact that they see that both parties are joined in this effort. And frankly, the president's done a superb job of keeping it that way. But frankly, Putin has helped as well, because he's just been increasingly vicious and brutal, and Americans don't want to stand for that on this planet.
Tom, this year marks the 75th anniversary of U.S.-Israel relations. Obviously, there's been a change in government in Israel in the last year, and there have been some difficult issues. Historically, obviously, this is an enduring relationship, a special relationship that is supported by both parties. But we are in difficult waters in your neighborhood, with obviously developments over the weekend illustrating that, obviously what's going on with Iran and other areas of the region. How do you see Israel and the United States right now in a time of uncertainty, both politically in Israel and in the United States?
Well, put it this way, Ron, if I knew we were going to have 3 prime ministers in a year, I would try to go for London's job, because they had the same number and I would have a better house. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. Listen, the reality of this is it's the Middle East. The Middle East is in constant turmoil. that's what it is. And I think obviously we have the objections, or the object of what I've been attempting to try to do is do what the direction I was gotten from both President Biden and Secretary Blinken. We have an unbreakable bond with the state of Israel, regardless of who the prime minister is, regardless of the situation on the ground, and that is not going to change. That said, there are plenty of times which we disagree with our friends, and there's times in which we have to step up and talk about what we need to do to collectively together to make things work. There's no question Israel is going through a transitional period. They have a vibrant democracy here. 72% of the country voted for the 5th time in 2 years. 72%, we can only dream of that in America. And by the way, 56% of Arab Israelis also voted. So the idea that there's a democracy is not alive and well is certainly not the case. And for those of you who read the New York Times, probably have seen that there's been a pretty active demonstrations here every weekend about some of the things that are going on here. And that's also healthy for a democracy. So I think that the challenges Israel has is not only the threats they have from a military perspective, vis-a-vis Iran or Hezbollah or Syria or what goes on in Gaza, but they also have a continuation of a country which is changing demographically. And let us not forget the West Bank and Gaza, which is continuing to drive what goes on here, including what happened this weekend. So this is a very lively place. But one thing is for sure, you talked about bipartisanship. As Nick just mentioned, literally this week, or the end of this week, beginning of last week, I've had 36 members of the U.S. Senate in Israel. Okay, led one group led by Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, and one led by Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader. And every chairman of every major committee was here. That was just last week. So the idea of bipartisanship is alive and well as it relates to the state of Israel and the surrounding neighbors. So I guess I'm lucky to have so much interest in this place. But it's there's no question of the working together in a bipartisan way is the name of the game for certainly for Israel and for this region.
Tom, I'm tempted to ask you whether those 2 trips were ever coordinated in a mutual event, but that I'll leave to others to comment on.
I tried.
I know you did. Toria, let me ask you.
Yeah, I'm going with fairness. Their schedules only overlap for a few hours. So the reality is, yes, they would have worked together. In fact, interesting enough, both Schumer and McConnell's messages to the prime minister and to generally to all the ministers in the government was basically the same. There was very little difference between both Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer's commitment to Israel. Also pushed back on the issues that we talk about, but it was quite nice to see a bipartisan messaging coming from the U.S. Congress.
Toria, I wanted to jump back to this notion. There are 2 geopolitical frameworks that have emerged. One that is a transatlantic one focused on Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and another one in the Indo-Pacific that Nick will also comment on in terms of managing a more aggressive China. There are also other arrangements. There are Quad arrangements that have been set up as well. How do we manage and these conflicts and try to deepen these partnerships also when inside these transatlantic relationships, there are countries that are certainly less bullish on being muscular with China. Germany is a good example of that. And also countries in Asia that are concerned about posturing with Russia. India is a good example of that. So how do these countries that are important players on the geopolitical stage, how do we work with them to manage and balance these dynamics? Toria, you reflections?
Well, Myron, I would say that it's actually all part of a whole. And as you said at the top, President Biden, Secretary Blinken came into office intending to strengthen alliances and partnerships with democracies across the world to address all the challenges of the world. So the coalition that they built in those first months was first put to the test on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And the interesting thing there was that we used the G7, which is primarily European, but also includes Japan, to start the work on security support, sanctions, humanitarian support, and strengthening NATO, obviously. But the Japanese made that investment because they knew that Xi Jinping was an equal threat to the rules of the road that have kept us safe and free and prosperous, starting in Asia, but also coercing countries all over the world. And therefore, if Japan made an investment in the European theater, that would give leverage for the Europeans to better understand that the same issues are at stake with China, and that they also need to increase their resilience vis-a-vis China. They need to strengthen their export controls, their investment screening, their supply chains, all of those things. So as we work with countries from Australia to India to Japan to the European Union to Canada and the UK, the conversation, of course, is about the individual issues that we're working on, but fundamentally it's about defending the UN Charter, defending sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, defending peaceful resolution of problems, and standing up to coercion and standing up to bullies, and using all of the tools in our toolkit to do that. With regard to countries like India, other countries that are having to make difficult decisions at this moment, India has always understood the China question being neighbors, but they also, as a result of that, became heavily dependent on the Soviet Union and later on Russia. And they've had to understand that as democracies, we need to depend on each other, and we need to diversify our supply chains, et cetera, so that we can manage, particularly in the context of both of these big powers, Russia and China, now working increasingly together to roll back the democratic successes that we've had all of these decades, and our needing as democracies to stand up against that and say no. So I would say, again, it's one conversation with many, many different chapters. You'll forgive me, I'm going to listen to colleagues for a minute, but I got to run off and see Canadians and work on another hot problem, which is Haiti. So I will leave you in a minute.
Tori, let me just do one quick minute on Iran. Can you just give us 1 minute on Iran, how you see efforts there right now? And then I'll turn to Nick and Tom for some reflections on other issues. Tori, what do you see as the prospect of that reform movement really picking up steam and seeing a change perhaps in the government or certainly in our relationship with that country?
Well, I'd like to hear Tom Nides on this one. I would say that I think obviously the Iranian people, and particularly Iranian women, have been incredibly brave in standing up for their individual rights in the context of a very, very repressive society. And the fact that this has gone on for months and months and months just speaks to the fact that the government in Iran is not serving its people. I think you know that we tried very, very hard to get back into the JCPOA when President Biden came into office, and we continue to believe that that is the best way to deal with the nuclear problem, thereby giving us space to deal with other problems. And this Iranian government could not get itself there in a manner that we could accept. And they are also becoming more and more aggressive in the neighborhood and against American interests. So it's a very difficult period, but Nides is living right there, so I think he should speak to this as well.
Victoria, thank you for being on today. Tom, I was going to turn to Nick next, but let's stay on this topic for a second, because I was also going to ask you about the normalization process, the Abraham Accords. Do you want to reflect on Ron for a second, what you see from your vantage point?
We're in a very dangerous place, guys. And when people, talked about ripping up the JCPOA, this is not a political comment, it's just a fact. And where we are today, you would argue, are we in better shape today than we were, 3 years ago or 4 years ago when we wanted to keep the agreement, and or what we were at the beginning of this year? And the answer, I think, is probably no. I mean, Iran is, if you believe what you read in the New York Times or the Washington Post, are pretty close to breakout if they wanted to. There's no question the situation on the ground in Iran is complicated. The economy has not collapsed, contrary to what some people would conventionally believe. They're still funding the proxies, which is dramatically problematic for us. But the president has been very clear from the get-go. He will not stand by and watch Iran obtain a nuclear weapon. So we're doing everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. And, we're working with Israel and many of the countries in the Middle East to make sure that doesn't happen. But I'm under no illusions, as Victoria is or any of us who are working on this issue. It's dangerous and it's complicated. And I think the reality of this is that it should be a wake-up call to everyone in the region when Iran is producing and sending drone technology to the Russians that have now been used against the Ukrainian people. So if you think there's not an axis here between Iran and Russia, and God, hopefully not China, it should be a wake-up call to all of us. So we're working on this day and night to make sure Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon.
Tom, I want to go to Nick, but do you have 30 seconds on what we can do to support the reform movement there? Is there anything that we're not doing that we might step up to encourage some of the reform efforts underway that, need outside external pressure?
Yeah, listen, we don't, obviously we don't support regime change, I guess, not publicly anyway. And I think ultimately, this has to come from the ground up. It is happening. I don't think it's near, a collapsing of the government or a collapsing of the current regime, but it's certainly a wake-up call. I think it's not only a wake-up call to the world, but obviously, listen, there's the women and men in Iran clearly want something different. How much they can get away with to get done is yet to be told. But I think ultimately, the behavior of the Iranian regime is certainly troubling for all of us. And given what they're now doing vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine is even more concerning. And listen, if you live in Israel like I do, the Israelis should and are concerned about the security of the state of Israel. And obviously, as we've said 100 times, we've got Israel's back, but it is certainly without some huge concerns.
Nick, I've obviously in the fall, the president's meeting with Xi Jinping was important. It was set as a positive exchange to steady the relationship, to create a floor perhaps, and to find ways, as you suggested earlier, to really work together with China where we have common interests, pandemic, health, climate, etc., but also to address significant differences in the relationship. Since that visit, though, we've had the balloon incident. We've had concerns about Chinese behavior with Russia, and we've had other issues that have popped up. And you've been tough in your messaging in China about these issues. Secretary Blinken certainly has had some tense exchanges. Where are we right now in the U.S.-China relationship? And where can we go to sort of stabilize the relationship at a time where we have so much difference in how to manage some of these geopolitical conflicts?
Myron, this is obviously a very difficult moment in the U.S.-China relationship. You're right. I was with President Biden in the meeting in Bali in mid-November in Indonesia, and we put forward our position that we had to have some stability, a floor in this relationship. The two leaders know each other very, very well. They had 3.5 hours of conversation. A lot of that conversation was focused, frankly, on the differences between us and in our interest, both of us, in trying to manage those differences effectively so that we don't end up in a conflict, God forbid, between our two countries. And I think we came out of the Bali meeting thinking that we had a chance in 2023 for greater stability. Secretary Blinken was scheduled to visit, as you know, Beijing to see President Xi Jinping and Wang Yi and Qin Gang on the 5th and 6th of February, but that became impossible after the balloon incident, which was an outright violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the United States. President Biden was absolutely correct in ordering the shoot down of that balloon. And we are now correct in salvaging the superstructure and examining it, as the FBI is doing, and holding China to account. The message that we have transmitted to the government here is that this must never happen again. We sanctioned 6 companies here in China that have been involved in the PLA surveillance balloon activities. And frankly, we've received a lot of support from our allies and partners from every part of the world for our position that we had to stand up to the Chinese on this issue. We're now in this surreal moment where the Chinese, who I think, lost the debate over the balloon globally, lost influence and credibility around the world because of what they have done, they're now blaming this on us. It's a little bit Orwellian, and it's a little bit frustrating because I think everybody knows the truth here. So you combine that, Myron, with the warning we've also given to the government over the last week or two that we fear they may be contemplating providing lethal assistance to the Russian government for its unjust and brutal war in Ukraine. And that's a direct warning that our president, our Secretary of State have made, that I have made on their behalf to the government here. And we hope that the government will, in Beijing, will take that warning seriously. So yes, there are issues where we do want to work with China if we can, but frankly, this is a moment where we've got to manage these differences, hold China to account, and build up our alliance system out here in the Indo-Pacific, which has been so effective. The strengthening of the U.S.-Japan alliance, the renewed vigor in our alliance with the Philippines, of course, the development of AUKUS, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and the Quad, where India and Japan and Australia and the United States are working together. Frankly, I think the Chinese may have been surprised by the strength of all of our democracies. I remember when I testified at my confirmation hearing, I told the members of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, that the Chinese believe, the Chinese leadership, that the East is rising and that the West, particularly the United States, was declining. I think 2 years into this administration, and on a bipartisan basis, I can say the United States is a strengthened position in the Indo-Pacific, and now the United States and NATO and the United States and the European Union are beginning to see the threat from China and the competition from China in the same way. I think that's surprised the Chinese. It's strengthened our ability to make sure that we're defending our interests out here. There's a lot more we can say, Myron. There are 1,000 issues that we're dealing with, but I'd like to focus on the balloon incident and China's position on the Ukraine war as two of the most important issues that we're dealing with right now.
I think those are the most important short-term issues, but Taiwan looms large as an issue as well in the U.S.-China relationship. And of course, we've seen more muscular rhetoric coming out of Beijing on that issue. We've seen signs of increasing expansionist thinking coming out of Beijing. And I know this is an area that is core and sensitive to this relationship. How do we manage this dynamic in the context of everything else we're dealing with? And obviously, Ukraine and that conflict is seen in this prism as well. But how do we manage that, Nick? Because we're going to have an election in this country next year. We're going to have representatives, perhaps the speaker, visiting Taipei. We're going to see, I think, an escalation potentially on both sides if we don't manage it very carefully. And that has huge risks, short-term and long-term. Also for the business community that have huge supply chain issues as well coming out of Taiwan. Do you want to reflect on that quickly?
Well, obviously, the United States has a unique responsibility here through the Taiwan Relations Act passed in 1979. It is our obligation, obviously, to maintain our own military strength in and around Taiwan in this part of the world, to make sure that the Taiwan authorities have the ability to deter any kind of Chinese offensive action now or in the future. It's also, I think, our responsibility to galvanize the rest of the world to make sure that that the Chinese cannot get away with coercion or intimidation against Taiwan itself. You saw after Speaker Pelosi's visit, and I was right here in Beijing dealing with the Chinese government here, this extraordinary use of power, military power, to try to intimidate Taiwan, the firing of ballistic missiles over the territory, the offensive action in the Taiwan Strait, violating the status quo of the last 70 years. And now I think you've seen a reaction, not just from the United States, which we've had a reaction, but also from Japan and some of the other countries in this region. They understand that 50% of the container traffic in the world flows every day through the Taiwan Strait, that any kind of disruption caused by China, the People's Republic of China in the Taiwan Strait, would have an inevitable, very negative consequence for the global economy. And of course, we want to live in a world where big countries can't push small countries around or small, in this case, not a country, but the Taiwan authorities. And so very important that the United States is stepping up, showing support as we do under our congressional authorization for defensive articles supplied to the Taiwan authorities, showing political support, obviously working on trade issues as we are. And I think the United States has stood up in very strong support for the Taiwan authorities. We'll continue to do that. And hopefully the message to Beijing, which will sink in, is that the United States and our allies want to see the government here respect the status quo, stand down from some of their more aggressive activities, and respect the fact that we need a peaceful solution to the cross-strait differences. That's a message that Beijing needs to hear, not just from us, and it's hearing it from us, but from countries in Europe, and they're beginning to hear it from Europe, as well as this part of the world.
Tom, when you went to Israel, I know one of the things that excited you about the opportunity, not only your commitment to the bilateral relationship, was the expansion and deepening of the Abraham Accords. And this is an area where you've given the previous administration some credit. There is work to be done. There is work that you have helped lead. Tell us where we are in Israel's relationship with some of its neighbors and where we could go. Could we see even more progress, for example, in the Saudi relationship with Israel in the years to come? And how do we get there? And how does the private sector play a role here?
Well, first, Myron, it's a great question. And when I was fortunate enough to be confirmed at my hearing, one of the first questions some of the Republican members asked, did the Biden administration support the Abraham Accords? And at that time, when I was getting confirmed, there was even questions, were we going to even refer to them as the Abraham Accords? And I said to the senator, Senator, I love the Abraham Accords. Let me repeat, I love the Abraham Accords. To be clear, the Trump administration and my predecessor, David Friedman, and Jared Kushner, these guys deserve, and Bibi Netanyahu, deserve an enormous amount of credit for having an idea, a vision, and getting it done. Okay? The Abraham Accords have made, in fact, Israel and the region safer, more effective, and I give them a lot of credit. We now need to take what was a great idea and an actual an event and make them more real and more substantial with not just the elites, but within the countries themselves. So you have Bahrain, you have Morocco, you have the UAE, you obviously have Jordan and Egypt, who are both early adapters, not necessarily the Abraham Accords, but early normalizers with these countries. And now our objective, the Biden objective, is to make sure those relationships with those countries are strong, not only on a bilateral, but a multilateral basis. And I think you see it every day. Trade between Israel and the UAE has gone off the charts. Israelis, I was just in the Emirates, get on a plane, and the plane is full with Haredi Jews, Orthodox Jews, as well as just general Israelis. Same thing with Morocco and Bahrain. So the Abraham Accords were not only phenomenally successful, have added to a whole security element, which I think all of us are happy with. But the question about can you expand it? Sure. Obviously, we were on the road to move on Sudan. Ultimately, they had a problem. They had the military took over the civilian government. Until that gets back to where it needs to be, obviously, we would love to have Sudan back in or be part of the Abraham Accords. You mentioned Saudi Arabia. Listen, I would personally, and I think I speak for a lot of people, wouldn't it be grand if Saudi Arabia normalized with Israel? And that's something that I think certainly Bibi Netanyahu is one of his biggest priorities, next to Iran, of course, is the normalization of Saudi Arabia. We want to play a role in that and try to get that to happen. The business community can play an enormous role in it. It's the importance of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia has had its struggles. It will continue to improve. As that improves, that will also incentivize the Saudis to do bigger things vis-a-vis Israel. So I think ultimately, if tomorrow, just hypothetically, Saudi Arabia announced they were normalizing with Israel, all the rest of the GCC countries would come with them. So this is not just about Saudi Arabia, as important as Saudi Arabia is. It's about the whole rest of the Middle East. And at that point, the whole dynamics of this place changes. And again, hugely successful, hugely important. And I work a lot of time and a lot of energy to try to keep building upon what the former administration did and try to improve it and increase it and add to it.
So we have time for just two quick questions, and I want to pose them both for each of you. So Nick and Tom, We often talk about national security trumping economic issues. The reality is, to me, economic security is tied to national security. The stronger we are competitively, the stronger we are as a nation, the stronger we are in America's leadership around the world. Nick, I want to turn to you because so much of the attention, even in your comments today, have been around security and defense arrangements. But we have a big economic relationship with China. Let's not forget that we do $1 trillion worth of business. It's not perfect. We have real concerns about China's record. We have concerns about its emphasis on state-owned enterprises and the regulatory behavior of the government. But we want to continue to work on this relationship in areas where we can do business. There has to be, sort of a traffic light approach, right? Areas which are red, areas that are yellow that need to be defined, and areas that are green. Where is the economic relationship heading at a time of great turmoil? And Tom, in your response, please also comment about where does economic relations fit into the narrative on the U.S.-Israel relationship, which gets so much attention on the security reasons for all the obvious reasons. Nick?
Well, Myron, as you know, one of the ironies of the present relationship between us and China, which has been so difficult across the board, is that our two-way trade is increasing. The figures just released by the Department of Commerce for 2022 show a $690 billion trade relationship, two-way trade relationship between us and China. That's a major increase over just a couple of years ago. And there are areas where Americans are doing well and should continue to do well. I'll just give you one example, agriculture. American farmers and ranchers sold nearly $41 billion of American products to China last year. That's 1/5 of all of our agricultural exports in the United States go to China, and it's our largest single export market. So that's a relationship that's going quite well and working for our farm community and our ranch community. On the other hand, I think technology is going to be the heart of the battle, Myron, as we think about the future of our economic relationship. In fact, I'd say the future of our relationship overall. Technology will be one of the most challenging and compelling issues. And you've seen our administration, the United States, with a lot of congressional support, take some very tough actions against China. Our October action, taken through the Department of Commerce, to deny to Chinese companies sophisticated chips and semiconductors and supercomputers, for example. And that was a major action that we had to take so that, as the White House put it in describing this action, we don't give the national security community here in China, the PLA, the Chinese intelligence authorities, technology to overtake us. And we protect what's important in our own economy and national security establishment. I think technology is going to remain a contested area. And of course, there are real limits in law about Chinese companies to invest in companies in the United States in technology areas that we deem to be important for our national security. And of course, Congress is now talking about, and the administration contemplating, what we need to do to encourage American companies not to invest in the civil-military fusion in the national security complex here in China. That's very important for our future. I think it's going to be front and center in our relationship as we go forward. So, I just came from an American Chamber event tonight in Beijing. We are encouraging American companies in certain areas to trade. We're defending their right to have a more level playing field because the Chinese are denying that to our companies. But there are also some areas where, frankly, we don't want to see American investment in trade because it's too important to our national security, which, of course, has to trump everything else in a relationship like this.
Tom, just 30 seconds, because I know that you fostered the cyber and you've been a proponent of the cyber and digital agenda between the United States and Israel, and we appreciate that because the U.S. Chamber has played a role in this. Your reflections, quickly.
Just as Nick said, this is the economics is the driver. Listen, this is a startup nation. This is a startup nation. This is the economic heart of the Middle East vis-a-vis technology and new technology, both in healthcare and in cybersecurity and every other element that Israel is leading the way. There's not a private equity firm or an investor who does not invest in Israel. In fact, arguably, the dependence on Israel for the U.S. funding of the technology is probably 90% of the money that comes to Israel technologies come from the United States. So this bilateral relationship with the United States on Israel, on economics, on trade. This is a small country, it's 9 million people, but it hits way above its weight. And everyone believes that this is a place that you want to invest in and to work towards to the next wave of technology. So economics is it. This is exceptionally important because economic strength creates defense strength, and defense strength basically obviously equals security. So it's all intertwined with each other.
Tom, one final sentence of optimism. Leave us with some optimistic thoughts about the state of the world or the world that you're engaged in.
Hey, Myron, just being with you is all I need is optimism. and sitting there with Ambassador Burns, listen, you have a lot of really smart people working on the world. The world's in pretty good shape. And let me just tell you, again, just like I started, America is here, okay? America is in the debate every day. And I will say with great certainty, the United States is as strong as it's ever been.
Nick, your final thoughts? Give us something to grip to.
I'm hopeful to end this program with. I would very much mirror what Tom just said. From my perspective, sitting here in China, looking out at the Indo-Pacific, our American position is stronger than it was 5 or 10 years ago. It's the strength of our alliances. It's the strength of our private sector. It's our innovative capacity and our R&D capacity, which comes from our research institutions and our big tech companies. And I do think that the Chinese now understand that the United States is staying in this region. We're the leader in this region in many ways, and that we want a future of peace with China. We don't want, as the President Biden makes clear every time he talks about this, we don't want conflict, but we're going to hold our own out here. And I feel optimistic. I'm just concluding my first year as ambassador about the American position in this country and in this region. And I thank the president for the opportunity to do this job. I thank the Congress for speaking with one voice between Republicans and Democrats on these issues. It's a great strength of our country. And Myron, congratulations on 3 decades at the Chamber. Tom and I, Toria, are going to be sorry to see you go, but looking forward to seeing your many accomplishments in the future.
Well, this has been a terrific way to close out my public chapter at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to have Ambassador Burns, Ambassador Nides, and of course, Ambassador Nuland with us today, talking about America's role in the world. It is clear that we are an indispensable nation. It's clear that America's leadership is needed at a time of geopolitical conflict around the world. It's important that we don't go alone, that we stand with our allies, that we build alliances even in areas of the world that we didn't talk about today. The challenges are before us, but the reality is that today the rest of the world is watching as America confronts Russia's aggressive behavior, as it deals with the challenges of managing China's rise, and as it deals with so many other issues that require U.S. leadership. So I am grateful for the incredible diplomats that serve our country. We heard from 3 of them today. I think the private sector role in this has never been more important in working with our government, and we continue to do that. I am not retiring from my commitment to be engaged on world events. I'm not retiring from my commitment to work with the private sector and ensure that we continue to see that close cooperation between the public and private sector. But I thank you all for tuning in today. I thank my many friends and colleagues and my former staff and current staff for their contribution to my 29 years. Without them, this would not have been a possible, incredible journey. So thank you all for joining us here today, signing off for the last time as the Executive Vice President, Head of International Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.